The subject of my lecture is American Reform Judaism and translations of the Passover Haggadah, case study of Shulchan. So this section is a later addition to the Haggadah, and it consists of the recitation of 3 verses from the books of Psalms and Lamentations. שבו חמתך אל הגויים, אשר לא ידעוך, והממלכות אשר בשמך לא קראו, כי אכל את יעקב ובניו רשמו, שפוך עליהם זעמך, ואחרון עמך ישיגם, תרדוף באף את השמידם, ייקח את שמי המדינה. Okay, so these verses are calling for vengeance of the Gentile nations who don't acknowledge them. The instructions in the traditional Haggadah at this section are to open the door, to recite the verses while the door is open, and then close the door. In the text or in the instructions, there's no explanation for why we do this, but there's a clue. It says here, fill Eliyahu's cup, open the front door and say. So we find that there's an implicit connection being made here between the reciting of these verses and the welcoming of Eliyahu. Eliyahu represents, in traditional Judaism, the messenger who's going to announce the coming of the Messiah. So we see that there's a juxtaposition here between the call for vengeance and the hope for redemption. So this section presents a challenge for the Reform movement for a number of reasons. Number one, the call for vengeance on the Gentile nations is in opposition to the Reform movement's universal and humanistic stance. The idea of a Messiah as a person has been rejected by the Reform movement. And instead, the idea is that there's a messianic age of universal peace and social justice. And third, that there's an implied connection between the two, that the redemption is contingent on the destruction of non-Jews. So in my research, I will be addressing the following questions. Number one, how has the Reform movement in the United States addressed the challenges that the section of the Haggadah raises? And number two, how does the evolution of this section of the Haggadah reflect the changing ideology of the Reform movement in America? My corpus consists of 10 Haggadot that have been published in the United States by the Reform movement or by individuals or bodies that are identified with it, starting in 1892 up until 2021. Okay, and to jump right now into my preliminary findings. Okay, so the first Haggadah that was published by the Reform movement was published as part of the Union prayer book in 1892. The first Haggadah that was published as a separate book was in 1908. And in both of these editions, the entire section of Shlo Chamatcha, including the part where we open the door, has been omitted. See that this is a page from the 1908 Haggadah. It jumps from Betaarik, which is a section that is after meals, and goes immediately to the next section of Hallel without the section. But what's interesting is that in one of the essays in the back of the book, there is a paragraph which talks about the cup of Elijah, and it talks about the custom of pouring the cup and opening the door. In 1923, the Union Haggadah was revised, and the section of opening the door for Elijah has been restored. And the door is open, and there are some verses that are read, but they're not the Shlo Chamatcha section, they're just the first verses of the Hallel section of the Haggadah. And there's an explanation in the paratext, basically saying that while we're negating the superstitious conception of Eliyahu, we relate to the Messianic age as an age of freedom, justice, and goodwill. From 1923 to 1974, there weren't any revisions of the Haggadah. In 1974, a new Haggadah was published, which is called the Union Haggadah anymore, it's just called the Passover Haggadah. In this Haggadah, there is a 4-page spread about Eliyahu, and here there's a justification for. In the paratextual material, there's a justification for the restoration of the opening of the door for Eliyahu. It was a custom that many Jews were used to, that they had seen in staters in their families, and they brought this back as basically in order to preserve religious symbols. And there's a sort of a convoluted explanation here about how we're trying also to preserve the sense of reverence before mystical elements of the religion, which is sort of in opposition to the more rational approach of the Reform movement. In 2002, a new Passover Haggadah was published by the CCIR, which is the Reform movement's official publishing house. And it's called The Open Door, and here the name, The Open Door, is very, it reflects the social changes in American society. It aims to be inclusive of previously marginalized voices, for example, women, the LGBT community. For example, in this Haggadah, all of the blessings, which in traditional Judaism start with bechet, there's an additional blessing which says bechet. There's an abundance of additional material in this Haggadah, which includes poems, stories, illustrations. The relevant section of Haggadah that we're talking about here is called Kos Eliyahu, in English, the cup of hope. And there's many additional passages that are marked as optional readings. You can see in the top here, it's in a smaller font, and on the page itself, it has a light blue background, which didn't come out. But that's supposed to signify that that's an optional reading. And in the optional reading, they've restored the Shulchan section here. But then afterwards, which is not marked as an optional reading, they give an alternative reading, which is calling for a totally different response, and not vengeance, but to give up anger, to abandon fury. If your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat. These are also verses that are taken from the Tanakh, but they're just completely opposite to the Shulchan verses that were in the traditional Haggadah. And finally, in the 2021 Siddur has the Haggadah of Mishkan Seder, which is there's a whole series of liturgical texts. So the Reform movement has published in the Mishkan series. There are actually 2 pages for this whole section. The first page is about Eliyahu Levi, and the second page is called Shvoch. So they returned here the Shvoch here, but they have changed it to we pour, instead of pouring out our wrath or anger, we pour out our hearts and souls. We pour out our souls. They let us pour out our hearts and souls for the sake of Tikkun Olam. But here in the footnote, they explain that this is a reinterpretation of the original text. That instead of pour out your wrath, we are now talking to transform the pouring out of our pain into a pouring forth of compassion. So, in conclusion, this section of the Shulchan it contains material that significantly challenges the ideological and theological stance of the Reform movement. We've seen that the section has been omitted, partially restored, and reinterpreted in the series of Haggadot that comprise my corpus. And hopefully, to get to the second of my research questions, we'll find that the study of this section may reflect the changing ideology and theology of the Reform movement and shed light on the process of the changes. And, thank you.